Born to Run by Tom Comitta, an audio chapbook as part of Heavy Breathing's AV series. This chapbook collages descriptions of running and jogging from over 60 novels. There's everything in here from Stephen King's The Running Man to Cynthia Voigt's The Runner, with a sprinkling of Charles Dickens, Agatha Christie, Samuel R. Delany, and so on. To experience this piece, a listener would get on a treadmill, elliptical, or any artificial exercise device. Put on headphones and press play. Born to Run. The night joggers were out as usual. The young man could see dim figures on the track, even in this pale light. He picked up his small travel bag and went to the gate, walking clockwise on the track, toward the white starting post at the head of the first turn. The joggers ignored the stranger, and he likewise paid them no attention. They would always be there. He put his bag down by the pole vault pit, looked up track, made sure no one was coming, and then walked up to the starting line. God, he thought, one more time on the line. He tried to focus on blurred emotions, a metaphysical photographer zeroing in on hard edges to a line in the center square. What was this he was feeling now? Nostalgia? Regret? He could not tell. His emotions had calluses like feet. In lane 1, he stood very still, looking down at his street shoes, joggers now going around him with curious glances, and tried to conjure up the feeling. After a moment, a trace of it came to him. You can remember it, he told himself. The starter would tell them to stand tall, so he stood tall for a moment there, in the night. There would be the set command, and then the gun. He took a deep breath and began walking into the turn, in the familiar counterclockwise direction, the way of all races, and thought, the first lap is lost in a flash of adrenaline and pounding hooves. Suddenly, he began running. He was running by the soft glow of a huge clear moon. He sought out the mental neutrality that is the refuge, the contained wan comfort of the runner. He grooved his mind upon the thin platinum rail of his task, a line that stretched out in front of him and disappeared into the gloom, further than he could contemplate all at once. When his trance broke and a word or phrase popped into his mind, his dizzy mind played with it like a seal with a beach ball, in a disturbing, gibberish mad way, the way your mind acts in the druggy twilight before sleep. He paused for a moment, leaning against the fence. It was hard to really concentrate, for he had a toothache, and as he ran, as his right foot hit the ground, it jarred the cavity on the right side of his upper jaw. The thing had come on only lately, and maybe it would depart as it had come, because it hadn't gotten worse, and proved a nuisance only when he ran. Lost in his thoughts, he headed toward his bungalow, ducked through the gates to avoid jumping fences, following the little path that ran north. He passed one of the workmen, who nodded curtly. He ran over the top of the big rock, following roughly in the tracks that Zula and Olivia had made a bit earlier, and then began working his way judiciously down the talus slope, eyes on the path ahead. He slid down into a gully, scrambled up the far side over fallen tree limbs, and emerged into a stand of pines, an island of trees between pastures. He pushed himself, arms relaxed, but up and pumping hard, through long grass that swept at his thighs. All of his body was working together for the run, in perfect coordination, his legs thrust down against the ground. His elbows were in tight, as his arms pumped easily. His lungs filled with the sweet air and then emptied, and his eyes kept sharp on the path ahead, sweeping close, sweeping far. A whole flock of familiar objects jogged past him then. A few milk cows grazed in the field, beyond a barbed wire fence. A tomato field with just a few fat globules ripening on the vines. He breathed steadily through his nose. He never got out of breath. A real runner never did, because it wasn't the lungs that took the strain, but muscles. Swiftly, he ran across the fields and down the little lanes which sometimes divided them. Now, almost hidden by the high corn on either side, and now emerging on an open field. Nor did he stop once, save now and then for a few seconds to recover breath, until he came on the woods to the east, where he was plunged in darkness. At once it got colder and darker under the trees, which grew close together, their black branches meeting in dense entanglements overhead, intertwining with the undergrowth lower down. 20 invisible people could have been near, but he couldn't see, he couldn't hear. The forest floor was flat, except for a long, yard-wide trough, like a dried-up stream bed or an abandoned trench. There was no real path to speak of, no sign of human life. Occasionally there'd be trees for dodging around, and roots for tripping over, and small rocks for losing your balance on. Sure enough, he missed seeing a shadowy log and tripped over it, falling. It happened so suddenly and so unexpectedly that his face mashed into wet leaves and damp earth, and he staggered back up to his feet, ran onward, fell again, and then ran once more. Now he was moving down a steep hillside, and he couldn't keep his balance. He tumbled helplessly, rolling and spinning over the soft ground, before finally coming to a stop at the foot of a hill. His face splashed into shallow, tepid water, which gurgled around him and ran up his nose. He was lying face down in a little stream. He jumped to his feet, and before leaving the stream behind, he had drunk from it, even though he knew this was unwise. Now he felt dizzy, and the world sometimes swirled around him. He was having trouble with his balance. The wind picked up, and he could only feel it through his fingers. The moon must have risen higher, because the woods were infiltrated with silver clouds of light that made patches of dark shadows. The shadows moved through trees. The wind washed cold over him. He didn't move. He stood, looked around, and narrowed his eyes on the shadows. He turned left, turned right, and scratched his collarbone with his wide thumb. Turning right, turning left, he wished he could interpret the scuffs and broken brush. Convinced he was lost, he ran on like a forlorn child, blubbering and wailing. He ran all night, always downward, delirious with hunger and exhaustion. And he was panting like a dog. He was dizzy. His mind had now taken up a melody, fur-elise, and played it constantly without apparent pattern. Skirting the edges of consciousness, he found himself at dawn in a clearing, where the train tracks had cut a swath across the forest. Following the rails, he moved on, as if dreaming. Sweat poured down his back and legs, stung his eyes, soaked his armpits. His emotions were intensely troubled, and his mind was utterly wrong-footed, off balance. When his vision cleared, he took a look at the sun. What he saw was simple, simpler than anything else. It was simplicity, and contained in it all complexity, all promise. It was revelation. It was the way clear, the way home, the light. The spirit in him was like a child running out into the sunlight. There was no end, no end. And yet, in his utter ease and happiness, he shook with fear. His hands trembled, and his eyes filled up with tears, looking into the sun. Yet he kept looking, and going farther, with that same childish joy, until all at once he had reached the road. He recognized the road. The same moment, his foot jabbed into mud. He staggered out on the asphalt, one foot sliding on flooded leather, took a hissing breath, and gazed around. Left, the road sloped up between the trees. He started right. Downward would take him toward the city. He turned toward the town and ran. He ran tight and hard, his fists clenched, as his arms swung up close to his chest. And so, the traveler jogged along the middle of the road, until he came, in great heat, and covered with dust, on the little marketplace of the market town. Here he paused, and wanted to fall down. He could have thrown up without any trouble at all. Lots of guys do just that. But he stood straight and locked his throat tight. His chest heaved. He looked around for the inn. There was a white bank, and a red brewery, and a yellow town hall. And in one corner there was a large house, with all the wood about it painted green, before which was the sign of the George. To this he hastened as soon as it caught his eye. Out in the early morning streets, the small group of runners made its way down University Avenue and turned north on 34th Street. They would traverse a large 7-mile square, known interchangeably as the Morning Loop, the 7-mile course, or the Bacon Strip, for a series of undulating hills. At 6:30 a.m., other joggers were out preparing themselves for the day's stress. Cassidy ran with a loose stride that approached awkwardness. He chatted quietly with Jerry Misner and followed the shadowy jogging path to the opposite edge of the park. There, concealed by trees, Count Rugen and 4 castle guards were rounding a corner, had scarcely turned it, when Mr. Sergeant Snubbin appeared, followed by Mr. Mallard. And Brother Tadger appeared, closely followed by the Reverend Mr. Stiggins. They passed bushes and trees and ducks in a pond, and these farmers running up and down, getting up a sweat. The main group, numbering perhaps 5, were running towards the gate. The second group included Miss Sally, Mr. Swiveller, and Samson Bass running uphill, past a block of big homes, fortresses of cement and brick, inset with doorways of stained and beveled glass, and windows of potted plants. And then, halfway up another block, a development built all at once in the 30s. They ran for a couple hundred yards. Then, the 3 of them turned and pointed to a wide shoulder on the opposite side of the road. It happened that Kit had been running too, and having the start of them by some few minutes, was a good distance ahead. As they were pretty certain of the road he must have taken, however, and kept on at a good pace, they came up with him at the very moment when he had taken a breath and was breaking into a run again, puffing and blowing. "Stop!" cried Samson. "Not so fast, sir. You're in a hurry?" "Yes, I am," said Kit, with so fixed a look of grief and despair in his eyes. Kit rather wondered what he wanted, but as he couldn't stop there, asking questions, he kept running. He was running hard, with occasional little springs, such as a weary man gives who is little accustomed to set any tax upon his legs. As he ran, he jerked his hands up and down, waggled his head, and writhed his face into the most extraordinary contortions. "What on earth can be the matter with him?" I asked as I stood in our bow window, looking down the street. My friend rose lazily from his armchair and stood with his hands in the pockets of his dressing gown, looking over my shoulder. From the window, we watched a young man running from house to house, still puffing, still gesticulating. In an astonishingly short time, minutes only, the street was full of people. Disorganized and showing every sign of acute fear, they set off in great haste, some going one way and some another. They seemed to have no definite destination or plan, just the one overwhelming urge to fly from the town. I changed into jogging shorts and a t-shirt. Poirot sat down, and looked out the window as Devon, now in a tracksuit, strode across the lot, followed by a train of rattled and nettled assistants. They ran around in the big back garden of the OE house. "Curious," said Poirot. The nurse opened the door and motioned with her finger for me to come. I followed her into the hall. My mother followed me. Poirot followed her. We had to get down the steps and into the woods to be safe. As I ran down the passage, suddenly everyone was moving, reaching for weapons. John Thorpe came running upstairs. Colette was downstairs in seconds, running toward the back door. Chifelisk saw him and followed him. And the servants ran up and down stairs perpetually. They seemed to be running in all directions. And then came the sharp sound of the church bell and the rapid peal of alarm. Cousin Charles hurried up the back steps and across the screen porch into the kitchen. Mother was still there, still wearing the white blouse and the blue high-heeled shoes. She looked at him, and he couldn't read her face. "Run," said Charles at the front door now. "Run, you fool!" "I've not done much running in the past few years, young man." "Go," he said. "Go! Go!" God! She lunged against the door and half sprang, half fell out. She was on her feet instantly and running. Her hair streamed out behind her, and she seemed very beautiful, almost goddess-like, and she ran into the lukewarm starburst of a million flashbulbs. June started to cry and ran out of the room. Charles turned on the doorsill to call to Constance. "Don't try to carry the safe," he said. "Put the money in the bag. Don't panic." He ran, and we could hear him screaming as he ran toward the village. Now behind me, now before me, now on this side, now on that, turned I my affrighted face in the same moment, expecting a furious brother here, armed servants there, an enraged sister screaming, and a father armed with terror in his countenance, more dreadful than even the drawn sword which I saw, or those I apprehended. I ran as fast as he, yet knew not that I ran, my fears adding wings to my feet. Thus terrified, I was out of sight of the door in a few minutes. Constance held to me with one hand, and with the other hand she kept Uncle Julian's shawl across her face. She moved through a world of shades of gray. The muscles in her legs and shoulders ached from the tension. Her eyes strained to see. I wondered if Constance would slip and fall, running through the light. But we had to get to the woods, and there was no other way. On the street I saw a man and woman walking towards us, heads bent and their hands on their hats. We ran into a couple of Italians we knew, McAdams, the vice consul. The crowd swirled around them and away, oblivious. We ran as fast as we could, bashed into things. There were screams from the crowd, followed by sudden tide-like movement. Men and women were tearing across the roads and fields. Their faces were blank and avid with panic. Constance was stumbling, and I wondered if we were going to fall on the ground in front of them, lying there where they might step on us. Then I turned toward the house, running again with Constance pulled behind me, and Ebert the grocer and his greedy wife were there, holding their hands to halt us, almost dancing together, and we stopped. I then went to the side, and Jim Donnell stepped in front of us, and we stopped. The main mass of the crowd fled at the sight of him. I took a cautious step, pulling Constance a little so that she followed me. Suddenly, she gave in. Worn out, beaten. She was panting. Her face was wet. "Tony," she said. "Tony. Tell me, Tony. What do you see? Another world? Can you see all the busy gods running about doing good deeds?" "I guess," I said, gazing absently. She turned on me suddenly, pushed me with a force of which I was unprepared, so that I stumbled back. And she turned and ran back up the road, looking like a modern Atalanta. I stared after her. Away to the eastward, the distant fires flickered, and now it seemed that here and there houses and barns were burning. Most of the doors were wide open, in the aftermath of escape. An older man with silvery barbershop hair ran out to the edge of the road. A gray cardigan flapped over his bare chest, and green plaid pants cut off at a comical length above his slippers, which were secured to his feet with black electrical tape. 6 devils congregated on the lawn of a mock tutor halfway down the street, and they turned at the sound of him. The old man ran fast, veering to arc around them. Dark aviator glasses covered his eyes, and he had a wireless rig stuck in his ear, into which he narrated his progress. I ran away in a great hurry. All the time, as I now see, I was conscious of extreme terror, and my heart was beating as if I had been running for my life. I thought about it in a jumbled way, without clarity, not understanding the compulsive and utterly irrational urge that had sent me running towards danger, when every scared and skin-preserving instinct in my life had been to shy away from it. I avoided the most frequented ways and took the most intricate, and thus dashed away through the endless succession of somber streets, which widened gradually, until I was flying for about 100 yards or so across a broad, balustraded bridge, with a murky river flowing sluggishly beneath. Beyond lay another wilderness of bricks and mortar. A dull rack was drifting slowly across the sky, and light rain drifted between the buildings. The drizzle had deepened into a steady rain by the time I started to get kind of tired. Then a cramp set in. Pretty soon, all I could do was walk, but the cramp really started to get to me, and I had to bend over and hold my side while I kept moving. My face was wet with rain. Drops ran down into my mouth. I covered my eyes with my handkerchief, brought myself under control by violent effort. I looked like a wheezing version of the hunchback of Notre Dame. As I made my way down the streets, I was not noticed outside. Everyone had disappeared into the gloom. The streets were swimming with water. I was wet through, running as fast as I could, splashing along as if in a shallow stream. I was breathless, bruised all over, and soaking wet, but I felt triumphant. I ran, digging my fingers into my gut to stifle the pain. I ran all the way from Plain Street along the East Road, and without halting turned up the Bywater Road, which ran for some way, sloping up between high banks of the river. Round a bend, along a furlong from the main road, I saw a runner far ahead of me, moving at a rapid clip, fast enough that I'd lose sight of him in the bends. I thought he was wearing a sleeveless white singlet, warm-ups, and a headband, but he kept disappearing and reappearing. And anyway, in the gloom it was hard to tell much about him. Then he turned into a tongue of trees and bushes where I couldn't see him anymore, and I knew what the loneliness of the long-distance runner felt like, realizing that as far as I was concerned, this feeling was the only honesty and realness there was in the world, and I knowing it would be no different ever. No matter what I felt, and no matter what anybody else tried to tell me. Slipping and stumbling, I observed that the blood flowed freely in my veins, but a weight of despair and remorse pressed on my heart, which nothing could remove. The afternoon rained on. Lightning quivered faintly on the verge of the horizon, and was the only sight that varied the dull gloom in which everything was wrapped. Within a very short distance of Bow Street, there had been a sudden, slight movement on the asphalt, where there had been none before. Shadows moved, rested, moved again. The manhole cover was rising. It paused, and something, eyes, glimmered. The cover suddenly slid aside with a clang. Richards suddenly boosted himself out of the manhole and leaned for a second on the seamed and split cement to get his breath back. Now he was pushing the cover back, and now he was running down the alley. He broke off through a backyard, through a ragged hole in a cyclone fence. After 4 blocks, he came running up, dashed along the bridge, then followed a right turn onto a gravel road that ran due north, heading generally parallel to the river. He ran for 20 minutes. It felt good. It felt better with each passing minute. But as he came down the steps and followed a road along the water, it became obvious that he was being followed. A small bald man was trotting behind him. As he drew closer, Richards began to grin, suddenly breaking into a run, as though to force himself away, scampering off at his utmost speed, nor once ventured to look behind him. "You're enjoying this," he thought. "You're crazy." Because in some weird and very approximate way, it was like a run in the Matrix. Richards turned, ducked among the big ferns that lined the riverbanks. Cautiously, he waited. After half a minute, Richards caught an obscure glimpse of running legs in blue jeans. And then his tail, he decided, was gone, and that was fine. He had calls to make, biz to transact, and it wouldn't wait. He ducked his head against the wind and continued on, moving through an area of dense foliage, and came out to the main road. There was a huge shopping center on either side of the road. A Main Street strip of honky-tonks, bars, and auto slot emporiums. There were neat middle-class homes overlooking the main drag from the heights, and a growing slum looking up from the rancid edge of the water. The rain fell in heavy drops, pounding him as he passed across a ghostly, abandoned construction site. 90 minutes later, he was cutting across the far edge of the no-man's land of warehouses, cheap beaneries, and shipping offices, separating one barren asphalt desert from another. He crossed the canal. Farther along, he passed the occasional liquor stores and smoke shops, then the X-houses, the hawkeries, the blood emporiums. Toward the port stood a featureless 10-story office building, in ugly yellow brick. Its windows were dark now, but a faint glow from the roof was visible if you craned your neck. An unlit neon sign near the main entrance offered "Cheap Hotel" under a cluster of ideograms. The streets were ghostly, silent. A rat crossed lazily, lousily, across the cracked and blistered cement of the street. Richards could see the skyscrapers rising into the clouds now, high and clean. The highest of all was the Network Games Building, 100 stories. The top half buried in cloud and smog cover. He fixed his eyes on it and moved on another mile. Breaking glass brought his eyes to the street. He sprinted to the nearest wall, moving along it. He passed a doorway, noted it for ducking, and kept on to the corner. Voices now, and more glass. He peered around the building's edge. 3 people vaulted from a shattered window display to join 2 waiting. Barking, a dog followed them to the sidewalk. One man wanted to climb back in. Did. 2 others took off down the street. As he stepped from the wall, he crossed the street toward the corner of the loading porch. "Hey!" Richards jumped violently and whirled. He darted sideways, instinctively getting a wall behind his back. "You!" He looked with hunched shoulders. "What you doing, huh?" Janeway's words echoed. Eckerd was the first to the street, Janeway following, Carl the last. They were too many. You ran in this situation. A simple calculation without shame. Richards hit the street. He darted forward and started to run. They followed the man diagonally across the intersection. "Help!" Carl cried out, panting. Eckerd shouted, "I can't catch him!" "Shit," Janeway said, and started to run. And could he move? Richards could tell from the quickness of the footsteps that this was it. He had the lead, sure, but could he hold it, and for how long? Ahead was a cafe, windows dark, entrance heavy-wooded. Richards turned toward it, because no more than a couple of blocks away, in the dark night, was an entrance to the highway, a steep incline, a hill, and Richards was always good at hills. If he could just beat Janeway to the incline, he knew he could hold him off, because in college, when he ran cross-country, he did great on hills. Not so sensational on the flat, because he didn't have natural speed, but other guys panicked when they saw a rise coming. Not Richards. Janeway had already cut his lead deep. He glanced back, and Carl had passed Eckerd, but Janeway was already passing Carl, and there they were, his 3 fates. Richards ducked his head and started pumping his arms with all he had, because Janeway was just slaughtering him. Janeway was faster, no question about it. Richards picked up the pace as much as he possibly could, and then went a notch even over that. But he couldn't shake Janeway. How far behind? 80 feet? 60 now? With every step, Janeway closed. Richards was staring into the darkness, trying to think of some other way to escape them, and dash deeper into the thieves' quarter. They had him, so do something. Do something! But what? In the end, what he did was altogether brilliant. Not brilliant like Einstein or Sir Isaac or Ervil and Wilbur, but still, considering the fact that he didn't have all year to noodle ideas around, he had no cause for taking a back seat to anybody. What he did was, without warning, Simply hurry across the highway, step over the yard-high divider, and start running for the underground entrance to the Zoo of Death. He glanced along 49th Street, trying to be sure if it was safe to enter. The concrete door began to descend. Richards raced toward the steps. The concrete door sank lower. He heard Janeway charging behind him, but all he concentrated on was reaching the steps and lunging up them. The gap was only 2 feet high now. He dove sideways, scraping his bare shoulders and back when he rolled. His body, and then his shoes, cleared the door a moment before it thudded into place. He got to a half-standing position and darted forward for a few paces, into the mouth of some dim, yawning cavern. And then, thinking he had gone wrong, changed the direction of his steps. Then stood still, not knowing where to turn. The passageway was so narrow that a tall man could stretch his arms and touch both sides at the same time, creating the claustrophobic feeling of a series of tunnels. It was the maze. A million miles of tunnel, a veining of expressways serving the continents, interlinking Chicago with New York, Detroit with New Alaska, London with Lower Australia. The passages wound on and on. Richards ran off down the tunnels. The wood creaked and settled. Water dripped. Footsteps sounded uneasy, and the shadows on the walls were always moving. Sometimes it was caused by light from water slapping against some walls. More often, it was someone running or creeping. The stench of mud and human waste was overpowering. In the distance, he could hear repeated sounds of hammering, the smashing of wood and steel, growing louder and more insistent. There was a final deafening crash from the dark corridor, followed by men shouting and running. And beyond them, somewhere in the unseen outside world, the insistent whine of sirens. Alert now, he moved on, past the trap doors of oubliettes, cells hacked out of the rock. The walls of these hutches were running with water, with some noisome exudation. Perilous steps led down to still deeper dungeons. He sprinted down the corridor, out of sight, went through several pairs of huge doors. The last 2 doors were closed, and he assumed locked. He spun and slammed the sole of his nylon running shoe into the door. It popped, cheap hardware falling from the splintered frame. It looked like the skeleton of a murdered idea. When Richards walked into the Dunn stairwell, there was no banister, so he kept one hand on the wall. The staircase was straight and very long, but eventually, after the 3rd flight, faint lines near head height indicated another door. Richards gave it a push. It opened. Another corridor lined with cages, big ones though, and inside, great baying hippos and a 20-foot alligator thrashing angrily in shallow water. Richards walked into the lobby, half ran, toward a sign that said, "To level 3." He turned and ran up the steps. This staircase was different. It was not nearly as steep, and it curved. There were strange candles burning high on the walls out of reach. The shadows he made were very long and very thin. He could see only the railing and the wedge of stairs twisting around and around. Richards moved a step away from the railing and looked up. A large red number 3 was painted on the wall before him. He opened the door marked "Personnel Only" on the landing and stepped into a vast dark space filled with books. As soon as he closed the door behind him, he heard footsteps, softer than his own, coming from the same direction he had taken. It seemed to him that the footsteps paused at the staircase, but he could be certain only that he heard them no more. Richard's stomach went cold. He could not hear any noises from the other side of the staircase door, but had a sudden, urgent image of a man creeping up the last few steps. He stepped quickly into the stacks and found himself in a long, empty aisle, perhaps a yard wide, between towering steel bookshelves. Far above, low-wattage bulbs beneath conical shades cast dim but distinct pools of illumination. Richards forced himself to move more slowly. Just as he reached a wide middle aisle, he heard the clicking of the door, which opened onto the staircase. Someone slipped inside and closed the door behind him. He could virtually hear the person who had just entered. wondering which aisle he had gone down. Richards could not help feeling a prickle of fear. Then he heard slow footsteps far off to his left. Richards began to move, and heard the person who had just entered the stacks start down one of the narrow aisles. His feet hushed along in soft, slow rhythms. Richards went as noiselessly as possible down the wide middle aisle. 3 aisles from the end, he stopped to listen. Richards peeked down a long aisle. Pools of light lay between columns of shelved books. He ducked down the aisle. It seemed as long as a football field, narrowing, a tunnel seen through the wrong end of a telescope. Richards moved quietly down the long, tight aisle. In a queer hallucinatory trick of vision, the spines and titles of the books seemed to creep by him as they moved, while he stood still. W.M. Thackeray, Pendennis Volume 1, W.M. Thackeray, Pendennis Volume 2, W.M. Thackeray, The Newcomes, The Virginians, The Yellow Plush Papers, etc. Richards closed his eyes and heard a man cough softly into his fist, 1 aisle away. His eyes flew open. The man who coughed took an almost silent step forward. Richards stood, still as a statue, afraid to breathe. Whoever it was took 3 swift gliding steps down the aisle. "Hello there!" cried a voice. Richard's heart stopped for the space of a single beat. "Stand still a minute!" cried the voice. "You're nuts," he muttered. Richards tried to speak, could say nothing. The dread was still in him, widening, heightening, thickening. The man in the next aisle turned into the middle aisle, passed before the head of the aisle in which Richards had been hiding. The gaunt man nodded. "All the runners are dead." "No. They aren't our problem anymore." He looked to Richards like a vampire in an old horror movie that had been thwarted by a cross. Richards looked around, startled. He was back from the dead, wasn't he? Home again, after an impossible journey across space and time. Killian laughed. "Oh, Richards, you're such a peach, such a rare, iridescent bird." "Stand right there, pretty boy," Richards remarked, shifting the hand in his coat pocket slightly. "Ben," Killian said with infinite gentleness, "sit down." Killian snapped the lid from a plastic squeeze bottle. Richard sat down and took the bottle with a nod. He did no talking or capering at this time. He was too tired, dizzy, heart doing fantastic rubber acrobatics in his chest. "It's over. I know now what I must do. And I warn you." Dan Killian was talking, but Richards heard him only distantly, distorted by an odd echo effect in his mind. It was like being trapped in a very deep well and hearing someone call down. His mind had gone midnight dark, and the darkness served as the background for a kind of scrapbook slideshow. In the world of the runner, as in the ocean, there is a hierarchy of ferocity. In the sea, the swift blue runner is eaten by the slashing barracuda, which is eaten by the awesome mako shark. In track, such relative positions are fixed more or less in black and white, and are altered only at great and telling expense. Pride necessarily sprouts and grows, a pride that can only come from relentless kneading of unwilling flesh, painful months of grinding, and burning away all that is heavy, and all that is strength-sapping and useless to the body as a projectile. The runner becomes almost haughty. Richards had gained this knowledge over 10 years. Even while the earth still shook, the ghost found himself scrambling through a narrow tunnel, staggering out onto an expansive vista, tumbling down a barren mountainside into the woods. He knew or had run against most of the top runners in the world. He had raced Ron Clark on the grass in Australia, winning with a big kick. He had suffered through a high-altitude 2-mile against the smiling, fierce Kip Kaneo, losing to a big kick. He ran because it was what he did, what he was. He ran because his body was built for it. He ran for himself, simple as that. But this afternoon, He had broken his right wrist at some point, face striped with scars where the bushes had torn him. He smelled the nauseating coppery odor of blood. Richards turned away. From a distance, the words rolled on. He sat stone-like in his seat. His hands dangled loosely between his knees. So, he thought, it's all come unraveled. All of it. I want to think. Goodbye, said Richards. He got up and went slowly up the aisle. What? Killian looked startled. Whoa, where's there to go? He pointed into the darkness. There was a short silence here, until Mr. Brownlow coughed impatiently. His breath unraveled the silence, shocked him as much as if someone had called his name. Pondering, Mr. Brownlow took up the thread of the narrative and ran with it. Born to Run by Tom Comitta, an audio chapbook as part of Heavy Breathing's AV series. Thank you to Sophia Wang and Lisa Ribovich-Kraye of Heavy Breathing. Born to Run consists entirely of excerpts from the following novels: A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, A Maze of Death by Philip K. Dick, A Scanner Darkly by Philip K. Dick, A Walk to Remember by Nicholas Sparks, A Wild Sheep Chase by Haruki Murakami, Clarissa by Samuel Richardson, Crash by J.G. Ballard, Cropper's Cabin by Jim Thompson, Dawn by Octavia Butler, Dahlgren by Samuel R. Delany, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, Execution Dock by Anne Perry, Forrest Gump by Winston Groom, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley, Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling, Ice by Anna Kavan, Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton, Coco by Peter Straub, Logan's Run by William F. Nolan, Lord of the Flies by William Golding, Marathon Man by William Goldman, Murder in Retrospect by Agatha Christie, Murder on the Links by Agatha Christie, Neuromancer by William Gibson, Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, Nova by Samuel R. Delany, Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, Once a Runner by John L. Parker Jr., Proof by Dick Francis, Rabbit Run by John Updike, Reamdy by Neil Stevenson, Rogue Mail by Jeffrey Household, Running Dog by Don DeLillo, The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes by Arthur Conan Doyle, The Art of Fielding by Chad Harbach, The Bourne Identity by Robert Ludlum, The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown, The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, The Great American Novel by Philip Roth, The Italian by Anne Radcliffe, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd by Agatha Christie, The Notebook by Nicholas Sparks, The Old Curiosity Shop by Charles Dickens, The Other by David Gutterson, The Pushwick Papers by Charles Dickens, The Princess Bride by William Goldman, The Protector by David Morrell, The Return of the King by J.R.R. Tolkien, The Runner by Cynthia Voigt, The Running Man by Stephen King, The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, Underworld by Don DeLillo, We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson, Zone 1 by Colson Whitehead. born to run.